Hi, hey guys, welcome back. We are going to continue on with unit 1.3, which is the world of the cell. And we're going to move on to part 2, organelles. So we're going to talk about what organelles are, as well as how they fit into the cell and their functions within it. All right. So let me readjust my camera. And we'll move on. So first we're going to talk a little bit about organelles associated with the outside of the cell. So some organisms have what's called a cell wall. Now a cell wall is a tough, rigid layer of cellulose, which is a carbohydrate, specifically it's a polysaccharide, as well as proteins in there. Now we see these in plant cells, algae, fungi, and even most prokaryotic organisms. What they do is it offers support to the cell, it gives shape to it, and it's also protection. It provides a lot of strength for the cell, which is why certain plants like trees can get so big because of a lot of the cellulose that they have stored within them. So these are on the outside of the very outside of a cell. So think about it, if I was wearing a suit of armor, the armor would be the cell wall. Now my skin would be the cell membrane. The cell membrane is a thin, flexible barrier that completely surrounds the cell as well. Usually, if there is a cell wall, it'll sit right underneath that. It protects the cell and keeps all the good stuff in and all the bad stuff out. It does allow some things to move in and out. That's why we call it a selectively permeable membrane. So it's selectively permeable, meaning only certain things can come in and out. Let's see. Also, it is made out of a type of lipid called phospholipids, and we call it a phospholipid bilayer because there are two layers to it. Now, if you look right here in the bottom left, this was a diagram of the cell membrane. So we have the lipid bilayer. Notice that there are these little yellow circles with two lines hanging off. Those are phospholipids. We have one on the top and one on the bottom. Now, in between there, that's not where the cell is. This is outside the cell, and in here at the bottom would be inside the cell. This is inside the membrane. So we have the two layers, the phospholayer, kind of like this to each other. Outside the cell, inside the cell, and then the two layers of the membrane. Notice it's not just phospholipids, though. We do have assorted proteins within there that have a lot of different functions, whether it's just to hold on to these carbohydrate tags or to allow for added transport. There's a lot of different functions that the proteins have within the membrane. All right. Here, again, an example of cell. This would be the cell wall. The green is the cell wall, and then the plasma membrane, and then inside the cell. The diagram here kind of shows you a little bit about what is going on. We have the cell wall is this structure with all these cellulose fibers going through it like that. There are other things in there like hemicellulose. There's some pectin, but these big thick ones, those are the cellulose. And that's kind of what you see here. If we go back to the photograph, these thick strands, those would be the cellulose within the cell wall. All right, let's move on. So we're moving on to organelles associated with the nucleus. Now you might remember that the nucleus is within the cell and it holds the DNA. So it contains and it protects the genetic material. It also will control most of the cell processes. Now it's not so much that the nucleus itself will do anything, but because it holds the DNA and the DNA is the blueprint, that's why we say it controls the cell processes, because everything that the cell needs to know how to do is found, all that information is found within the DNA, and the nucleus protects the DNA. Now, as we said, the DNA is the instructions for making proteins. So it's very, very important. Proteins run pretty much everything in your body. They're what give you your traits, what told your body where to put different parts, like where to put the fingers. I don't have a finger sticking out of my forehead. It's because the DNA said not to put it there. Outside the nucleus, we have what's called a nuclear membrane. It's also could be called the nuclear envelope, and it is just like the cell membrane, it's a double layer membrane that completely surrounds and protects the nucleus. It's even more selectively permeable than the cell membrane because you don't want a whole lot of things going in and out of the nucleus and messing with your DNA. Now, some things do need to move in and out of the nucleus, and that's where the nuclear pores come in. They're little tiny holes that will allow very, very specific material in and out of the cell. So if you look at the diagram here, the entire structure, that is the nucleus. The purple on the outside, that's the nuclear envelope, and the holes that we see, that would be the nuclear pores. The DNA or chromatin would be inside there, not this yellow blob in the middle, that's the nucleolus. So the nucleus not only holds the DNA, it also holds an organelle called the nucleus. And this is very important because the nucleus is what will make the ribosomes. And we're going to see that the ribosomes, although small, have a very, very important function. All right. So we're going to start talking about assorted organelles that are associated with the cytoplasm. Let's start with for structure. So we already mentioned that there is the cytoplasm. It's very, very important because it is that gel-like stuff that will fill up a cell. It helps to provide shape to the cell. It supports the cell membrane, keeps it from kind of flopping in on itself. It also holds up the organelles so that they're not just all collapsed in a big mess on the bottom of the cell. So it kind of supports them, like how water in a fish tank supports the fish and all that. The fish can move through it because they can swim through the water. It's kind of like what the cytoplasm is. It supports the organelles so that they can move around in it. Yeah, the organelles move around the cell. And they do so with help from our next part, which is the cytoskeleton. So the cytoskeleton is kind of similar to our internal skeleton. You know, our internal skeleton, it helps us to give us a shape and posture. It gives us strength, and it helps us to move around. Our muscles attached to our skeleton, so which is why we can move them. Well, the cytoskeleton, which includes things like microtubules, microfilaments, intermediate filaments. Now, they do the exact same thing. They run throughout the cell membrane, or a little bit into the cell membrane. They also run throughout the cytoplasm, and they can actually attach to the organelles and aid them in actually moving around the cytoplasm. So here you can see microtubules kind of stem from the middle and stretch outward. Intermediate filaments are the opposite. They stem from the outside and stretch inward. And then we have the microfilaments, which kind of go along the outside to provide strength to the cell membrane. Oops. All right. So organelles around the nucleus. Now we've mentioned ribosomes, they're made by the nucleolus. So these are itty bitty little tiny organelles that have one heck of a large job. See, they're made out of, first of all, RNA, which is a type of nucleic acid, and proteins. But their actual job is to make all other kinds of proteins. So I kind of find that fun and interesting that these little tiny organelles made out of protein help to make protein. Now, we said they're made within the nucleus, specifically inside, made by the nucleolus inside the nucleus. And then what happens is they will leave through the nuclear pores in the nuclear membrane, and they will be, or not they will pick up mRNA, and they will use the mRNA as a template to build amino acid chains, which would become our proteins. Now, once the ribosome is done making those amino acid chains, the protein actually isn't ready to be functional yet. They have to take it to something called the rough ER, or rough endoplasmic reticulum. And if you look in the picture here, it's directly on the outside here of the nucleus. Now, the reason why we call it the rough ER is if you look, there's a whole bunch of little dots. Those are ribosomes. So the ribosomes attach to the rough ER and they bring the protein to the rough ER because the function of it is to modify the protein into a functional form. So sometimes the protein needs to be, well, it always needs to be folded up, but sometimes it needs a little help folding it up or to refold it or to add certain molecular tags to it. All that would be done at the rough ER. Now the smooth ER, it's a little bit different shape, but look, it's still connected to the rough ER. So a smooth endoplasmic reticulum, we call it smooth because there are no ribosomes attached because it doesn't really help much with proteins. It can store certain enzymes, but its primary function is to make lipids, like the phospholipids for the membranes, or certain steroids, or good cholesterol that your body needs to function properly. Now, altogether, the endoplasmic reticulum is kind of like this big passageway. If you notice here, it's even attached in some places to the nuclear envelope. So it does allow passage from the nucleus to different areas within the smooth and rough ER. So it can allow like tunnels of passageways as well. But in general, rough ER modifies proteins, smooth ER makes lipids. All right. And organelles that are further out in the cytoplasm, first we have vacuoles, which we can see like right there. In animal cells, they tend to be smaller. In plant cells, they usually tend to be larger. Bless you, bless you. And these are storage organelles. So they'll store excess water, salts, other ions, proteins, carbohydrates. They store extra stuff that the cell might want to use later. The Golgi body is this little guy right there. Pew, 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 pew. Kind of looks like a stack of pancakes. Now what this is, it's like the post office of the cell. So we have these stacks of membranes, and what happens is, remember how we said that the cell can make proteins or lipids with the help of ribosomes, rough and smooth ER? Well, if those are molecules that need to be sent out of that cell to travel to other places within the body, then they're going to go to the Golgi apparatus. At the Golgi, the molecules, the protein or whatever, is going to get modified. It's going to have tags on it. It's going to receive molecular tags so that the rest of the body cells can recognize it as self and not as foreign. This way it won't be attacked. So it'll be modified, packaged, and then they'll be sent to the very, very ends of these stacks where it'll break off into these little vesicles. Now these vesicles will then carry it like a taxi all the way to the cell membrane where it'll fuse with the membrane and then push the protein out of the cell so it can go travel throughout the body. Lysosomes, we can kind of see that here. It is a small sac of digestive enzymes. So the function of the lysosome is to break down different material that maybe doesn't work anymore. So if it's an organelle that's faulty, it can break that down. It can break down stuff that the cell ingested, and it's going to break things down, recycle what it can, and then remove the rest as waste. Now there is another similar one called the peroxisome, which kind of has the same function, but instead of digestive enzymes, it has hydrogen peroxide in it. We don't worry about that later. All right. So organelles associated with energy. First we have chloroplasts. Now we see these in organisms that do what's called photosynthesis. So plants and certain other organisms will have these. Animals do not. And what they do is, we mentioned photosynthesis, and that's a chemical reaction where the chloroplast will take water and carbon dioxide and using the power of the sun, so it's going to use light as a catalyst to start the reaction. It's going to break the bonds in the carbon dioxide in the water, and then use that materials, the atoms, and rearrange them into glucose, a type of carbohydrate, a food molecule, in other words. Now, the reason why they need that is because, well, our next organelle, the mitochondria. Mitochondria are organelles that release energy stored in food molecules. You can see the picture of that here. What the mitochondria does is it takes glucose and it breaks apart the bonds of the glucose. The glucose is the primary food molecule. And when it breaks the bonds of glucose, it releases energy, and it takes that energy and transforms it by storing it within another molecule called ATP. Now, ATP is kind of like a rechargeable battery for the cell. Once the ATP has been energized, it can travel to all the different organelles within that cell and power them so that they can do what they need to keep the cell alive. Because when your cells are alive, you are alive, and that's a good thing. Now, it might seem kind of weird, why would a plant cell make glucose just so that it can break it apart? Well, all mitochondria need glucose. For us animals, we get it through our diet. So we eat food, we digest it, we get glucose from it, and then that will power our cells. On the other hand, plants don't eat. Instead, what they do is photosynthesis. So since they can't eat to get glucose, they have to do it another way, and that's by creating it using photosynthesis. All right, so 3 ways a cell can move. First way is with flagella. Now, normally there's only like 1, 2, maybe 3, but there can be more. These are really long whip-like structures that will help to push the cell along. Think of it like the tail of a dolphin. So we have the body of the dolphin, and then the tail moves behind it and kind of whips up and down or back and forth to push it along. That is what a flagella does. So it's 1, 2 long whip-like structures that when they beat, they push and propel the cell forward. Cilia is different. If you look at the picture in the middle, you'll see that instead of these long structures, we have these really, really short ones. So cilia are these small hair-like structures that act like a whole bunch of oars in a boat. And when they all move together, then they help to push the cell along that way. So instead of one big tail, they have a whole bunch of little oars that paddle their way through the water or whatever medium they're living in. Pseudopodia is a temporary projection of the cell membrane, and that's seen in this last picture here. So pseudo means fake, and podia refers to feet or foot. So pseudopodia is a fake foot. Now, what that means, hold on one moment. Now, what that means is that if the cell wants to move, it'll actually like stretch out its cell membrane so that it's farther away than it was. So it just kind of takes it and stretches it out. Then it'll stream the cytoplasm into it, and that'll cause it to move forward, and then it drags the rest of it behind it. Think kind of like how snakes move, how they kind of stretch forward, and then you see all the muscles bunch up as it drags the rest of it. It's very similar to that idea, or like a worm. But think about this more on a cellular level. So amoebas tend to do this. They stretch out these finger-like projections, and then they'll stream the cytoplasm into it, and that'll cause the rest of it to be dragged forward. All right, so just a couple quick pictures for the plant and animal cell. So here's a plant cell. You see this thick part on the outside, the green portion. That's the cell wall. Underneath that, we have the cell membrane. All this light green inside, that is the cytoplasm. Here we have our nucleus surrounded by the nuclear membrane that has nuclear pores in it. Inside we have the nucleolus. There would also be the DNA in the form of chromatin, but they're not showing that here. We have the rough ER covered in, covered in ribosomes. Here's the smooth ER. Here's the Golgi. We have lysosomes. We have big vacuole. We have the mitochondria, and we have the chloroplasts. Those are all the ones we've been talking about. Yep, for this one picture, yes. All right, and then here's an animal cell. On the outside, we have the cell membrane. Inside, pale yellow, that is the cytoplasm. We have our nucleus surrounded by the nuclear membrane. You can see a little nuclear pore there. Here's the chromatin. That's a way that the DNA can kind of fold in on itself. Nucleolus, which makes ribosomes. We have our rough ER, and the little red dots all over them are the ribosomes. Here's the smooth ER. We have the Golgi apparatus. We have vacuoles. These are the lysosomes. And the peroxisomes, we mentioned these, they weren't in the notes. They're very similar to the lysosome, except instead of using enzymes to break apart material, they use hydrogen peroxide. So we have the mitochondria. We have they call them centrosomes. They're also known as centrioles. They help in cell division by moving the chromosomes around. We'll get more into that when we discuss mitosis. And all these lines you see, the green lines, the purple lines, those represent different elements of the cytoskeleton. I think that's everything for this picture. All right. So now we have our additional resources. So we have a few science in pajama videos. We have one where we kind of go over the parts and label the parts of an animal cell. We have one where we do the same thing, but with a plant cell this time. So we label all the organelles in the plant cell. And then we also have one where we kind of list the different organelles and match up their functions. In other videos, we have an amoeba sister, introduction to cells, the grand tour. So it's kind of a big overview of cells. Good information. I love the amoeba sisters. We have nucleus medical media, which has biology, cell structure. It has a great 3D animation to kind of show the different organelles within the cell. Bozeman's science, a tour of the cell. Again, just kind of going through the different organelles, identifying them, talking about their functions. And last but not least, because why not, we have Jam Campus with the parts of a cell song. So, why not? It's fun. Anyways, you guys, I hope that helps you. I'll post a link for the Prezi in the description so you have access to those additional resources. But in the meantime, you guys, stay awesome, stay curious, and most importantly, stay safe and healthy. All right, you guys, take care. Bye-bye.